Welcome to today's session entitled 2017 Hurricane Season, the effect on older adults and what funders should know. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. When you've joined today's webinar, you selected to join either via phone, call, or computer audio. If for any reason you would like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing the audio pane in your control panel. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane at the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And now I'd like to introduce John Feather, CEO of Grantmakers in Aging and moderator for today's webinar. John?
Thank you, Tracy. I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us today for this important topic. We want to thank the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, the Florida Philanthropic Network, and the Patterson Foundation for their co-sponsorship of today's webinar. As always, we want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation of New York, whose support allows us to provide these webinars free of charge. When faced with how to best respond to the needs of older persons in a disaster, funders need to combine their knowledge of all three components of this work: knowledge about philanthropy, older adults, and disasters. Today, we are very pleased to have three panelists who will provide us with information and statistics on the effects of the hurricane season on older adults and how the philanthropic community can best support the needs of older adults following hurricanes. With us today are Anna Hurt, the Assistant Director of Grants and Programs at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, Bob McFalls, the President and CEO of the Florida Philanthropic Network, and Deborah Jacobs, the President and CEO of the Patterson Foundation. Welcome to you all. As Tracy mentioned, you can enter your questions for our panelists in the question box on the right side of your screen. I will read the questions to our panelists during that portion at the end of this. So Anna, let's start with you. Please tell us what we know about the disaster response and this past hurricane season, and what you've learned from the efforts that your center has been doing.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, John and Emily, for having me on today. I'd like to start off just by going over the recent disasters we've seen in the U.S. during the last 2.5 months. And it's been truly astounding what's happened in the last 2.5 months across the U.S., just in terms of the disasters that have occurred and the response that has had to be mounted by NGOs and funders across the board. And then after we talk about that, we're going to talk about older adults and what funders should be considering when allocating grants in these areas. So we're going to start with Hurricane Harvey in Texas. And as you all know, Hurricane Harvey made landfall on August 26th near Rockport, Texas as a Category 4 storm. The damage estimates right now in Hurricane Harvey range from 75 to 190 billion. That's billion with a B. We're a long ways from knowing an actual total of damages there, but it's by far one of the costliest storms we've ever seen. Just 2 weeks later, on September 10th, Hurricane Irma made landfall in Florida. At one point in the Caribbean, Irma was a Category 5 storm, and one of the notable things about Irma was that it had a really long land path, 5 days, over the U.S. Virgin Islands, through the Florida Keys, through mainland Florida, and then on north, affecting Georgia. And then 10 days after that, we had Hurricane Maria, also a Category 5 storm, swept through nearby and similar areas in the Caribbean. Maria leveled much of Puerto Rico and nearby Virgin Islands, and there's a lot of logistical issues that have gone on surrounding Puerto Rico and getting aid in and out of there. It's also been a difficult situation to manage because the damage on the island is so complete. It's not something that we can go in and fix. There's not things there left to fix. It's something that we have to completely rebuild. And then most recently, throughout October, we had significant wildfires in California. More than 40 people died, several hundred were injured, more than 100,000 were displaced by the fires, thousands of homes, businesses were destroyed. And the fires also affected life in general across the area, like disrupted school, as well as business operations. And it's one of the most significant wildfire events we've seen in terms of just how it's affected people. So there's many needs we've seen reoccurring across all these disasters, such as housing, health, mental health, communications, and systems repairs, especially in Puerto Rico. Again, especially in Puerto Rico, we've seen the need for water and infrastructure repair, schools and daycare recovery, and business recovery. In any disaster, and certainly in each one of these, older adults have faced a lot of unique challenges. We know that chronic disabilities or conditions require extra assistance or leave to leave an area, to return to it, and to recover following a disaster. When you consider that 3 million older adults report they can't perform basic living activities such as bathing, shopping, dressing, eating, just imagine how overwhelming dealing with a disaster is for each of them. The days following a disaster, if they are in the area, are often full of additional stress and suffering because their normal lifelines are interrupted. They might not be able to access medications or the technology that helps them function independently. I just also wanted to mention the census numbers from last year for those over the age of 65 in the most affected areas. In Texas, that's 12% of the population. In Florida, it's 20%. In Puerto Rico, it's 19%. I don't have a good number for the Virgin Islands, but those are some of the most affected areas. And consider that out of those percentages, 80% of them have at least one chronic condition such as heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and 50% have two. And we can go on to the next slide. Sorry, Tracy. And the next slide. And each of these factors for older adults are things that I've been talking about, are things that those of us working in funding and responding to disaster preparedness and recovery should be paying attention to. This slide just has a few facts about older adults and disasters beyond what I just mentioned. Studies have indicated that in disasters, people who are evacuated, so a nursing home or assisted living residents who are evacuated, usually experience additional illness. In Katrina, there was extra deaths following hospitalizations and other things that were associated with their evacuation or moving around just following that disaster. And the next slide. Thank you. So we're going to flip over to the disaster playbook. All of you can access the disaster playbook. It's www.disasterplaybook.com. And so it's designed around 15 strategies that are aimed at helping foundations and anyone involved in community recovery think through the areas affected by disasters and how those areas of the community can prepare for and recover from an event. We can go to the next slide. We're going to look at our strategy that's specifically around aging and disabled populations. And I'm sorry, can we flip down one more slide? Thank you. I just want to start with this one, which is the takeaways. The first is that preparedness is really important. Outreach to older adults in the areas you are already serving, finding out what their needs are, what they will need during and after a disaster is really important. And while we're right now in the throes of early recovery all over in each of these disasters, it's never too early to think about what should I be doing or funding that will help preparedness the next time. Another takeaway listed here, planning goes kind of hand in hand with preparing. It's working with your emergency response officials at the federal, state, city, county level, knowing who they are and really advocating for older adults and their needs as those officials work on their emergency plans and kind of integrating those into how they're going to respond to disasters. A few things, and then we can flip back one to our practices. Thanks. A few things we can be doing right now as funders, supporting workshops and seminars that assist older adults in accessing benefits and assistance following a disaster. So that would be helping them access any FEMA benefits or other government benefits that are open, accessing the things that are available to them through nonprofits that are working in the disaster recovery space. I would also add that supporting transportation or ways that they can access those workshops, because that might be difficult for them as well. Another key area is advocating the rebuilding codes, because we have the opportunity to rebuild as it should be or better, and we should be taking advantage of that as much as we can. Third, in preparedness and planning time, support the coordination and communication methods, and that goes back to that piece about, knowing the needs, really thinking about the needs of older adults before a disaster happens and how they're going to access information, as well as their unique needs during times of evacuation or shelter. Four, pay special attention to your nonprofits working in health and mental health. odds are they're already seeing older patients. They're tied into their needs very well, and they're going to be able to really help you both advocate for and meet those needs. And finally, I would just say reaching out to the network of responding organizations in the disaster area. That means knowing your VOAD, your federal responders, the grantees you already fund, and they're all working with older adults in a variety of ways, even if it's not their primary mission. And there's an opportunity to advocate for the needs of this group of people and also ask what they're seeing and how you could help support them during this time. That network and communicating across sectors is really, really important. I was in a meeting a few weeks ago where someone mentioned that they didn't think that they served a few different populations, and I was like, yeah, but you do. Even if you're a food bank or you're in legal services, whatever you do, you still touch on all these different vulnerable populations. It just might not be how you think of your primary mission. And then on the screen, and if you go to the website, there's funder-specific innovative practices, and we have at the bottom of this page also a lot of additional studies and resources listed for you to go and access as you can. And if we can flip forward 2 more slides. Yep, and then the last thing I want to mention is you can create your own playbook from the disaster playbook. So you can create an account, it doesn't cost anything, you don't get a bunch of emails, and you can go through and save things out of the playbook that apply to you and your work. So this is my personal playbook, and it has some strategies and items that you can see here on the screen that I've saved because I get asked about them a lot and I talk about them a lot. But you can certainly go through all of our strategies and resources and save what you would like for yourself onto your own playbook, and it collects them all in one place for you. Before I close off, and we're about to go to the video, I just wanted to play a short video clip for you. The video clip is actually from the playbook's health and mental health strategy, but I wanted to play it for you because we know that disasters leave older adults more vulnerable to medical emergencies and mental health needs. And so this video is largely focused on mental health after Hurricane Sandy. And I thought it would help us think about how big the mental health needs are across the board. And while we watch it, just keep in mind that older adults are likely to see anxiety heightened significantly through a variety of ways following a disaster. And I just think it's something that we should be paying really close attention to in our recovery from all of these different disasters.
The video, we know that philanthropy plays an important role in disaster relief and then disaster recovery and also preparedness. So as a leader in the philanthropic community in Florida, what are you finding with your members and what advice are you giving to them?
John, I'm sorry, I lost you for a second. Were you referring to me?
Yes, I was. I'm sorry.
Thank you,
yes,
John.
Please.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we basically here in Florida, we do have both the great advantage of having a large senior or older population in terms of resource, but also it does present some unique challenges for us when we are faced with a natural or a disaster. Here at the Florida Philanthropic Network, we work with our members on a daily and an ongoing basis to strengthen philanthropy through our research efforts, our education efforts, and our public policy. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So our mission is really to promote, develop, and advance these philanthropic aims throughout the state, and to connect leaders to promote, develop, and collaborate together in the best interest of all Floridians. And we certainly, as I said, are very sensitive to the growing older population here in our midst, and as aging individuals, one to which we are also contributing. So if we could go to the next slide, one of the things that I have found in doing disaster relief and response work is the strategic importance of partnerships. It's vitally important, as Anna said, that we prepare and that we plan together before an event occurs. I think it's critically important as donors that we collaborate and get to know one another, and that we have clear communication vehicles as well. I think it's also really important to recognize following a disaster event that we need to be committed for a long-term solution. And by that, I mean that our vision recognizes that recovery does take a period of time. I would say at least 24 months to really get ourselves situated. So the importance of partnerships cannot be overstressed, I think, in terms of our preparation efforts and recognizing the nonprofit organizations that are available and willing to respond following a disaster event. I know a number of our funders did post-hurricane surveys with those nonprofits to gauge their availability then to respond. On a personal note, if I could go to the next slide, we recognize that in some communities there are more unique challenges than others. I know when I was doing disaster response work in a previous role as the CEO of the Area Agency on Aging in Palm Beach and Treasure Coast during the 2004-2005 hurricane seasons, we discovered that it was almost impossible to know who was at home and who wasn't in terms of snowbirds when you would go into a community of 16,000 residents or another community of 10,000 residents in terms of going door to door. But our commitment was to respond and to follow up to requests for assistance that came through the emergency management system of inquiry, or to 211, which was our partner with the Elder Helpline, to respond to individual requests for help following an outage period where individuals were without food or without power, without food preparation for days on end, and actually it turned into weeks on end, up to 3 and 4 weeks. So we were going door to door, checking on individuals and delivering food, ice, and water. And during this time period, we actually provided assistance to 185,000 seniors through a great partnership and collaboration of our vendors and our partners, our provider partners, and with the great assistance of 3,800 volunteers. During this time period, the emergency coordinating officer for the State Department of Elder Affairs wrote me a poem to capture the great work that was being done, and within that he did talk about until we reached every door. We did not want to stop until every need was addressed. I think if we could go to the next slide, we just need to remain open to the resource that elders, that seniors themselves bring to the equation. We had a group of volunteers called Seniors Offering Solutions, and they had named themselves long before the hurricane season, but they brought forward this Help Alert Door Hanger project to help communities to prepare and have a communication mechanism to prepare in advance and to let one another know if you're going to be out of town, then just put this up in your window, and it would say, okay, I'm okay. There's no reason to stop here. But if you needed help, you would just flip it over and put it in your window. We did learn it was really important for us to communicate that this really didn't need to go on the door hanger, because in the wind you're not going to hang on to that door hanger very long. And really proud to say that the Palm Beach Post also assisted us with distribution of this through their entire Sunday distribution of newspapers, so that once we launched this campaign, again envisioned by older adults themselves, it became very much a robust campaign, and one that was received entirely well. And then my last slide here, before we turn into John to questions and so forth, is that Florida also has a great resource in the Disaster Preparedness Guide for Elders. Preparedness, as we said earlier, is key, and this guide is updated on an annual basis. It's available in electronic format on the Department of Elder Affairs website, but also they do produce a number of print copies as well. And it's just a great communication tool, but a great preparation tool, very encompassing of all the different aspects of how we need to prepare. So I'll pause there.
Well, thanks so much, Bob. I appreciate that. And we have some questions coming in, but reminder that you can type in your questions in the question box. It's on the control panel that you see on your screen. Just open that box and do that if you would. And we will come back to that after we talk to Deborah for a moment. And like I say, we already have some good questions coming in, but we are grateful to have all the other ones that you have. So Deborah, let's turn to you at this point. You are a leader of a foundation in Florida that certainly has a local impact, but works nationally. So as a foundation leader, what do you see as best practices for philanthropists in large-scale disasters?
Okay, I'm going to do some context setting first, and then I will get to your question, John. I have a unique role in this call because the Patterson Foundation supports grantmakers in aging. The Patterson Foundation supports the Florida Philanthropic Network, and we also support the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. And we view it there's a Venn diagram for this particular webinar from the standpoint that every funder is a disaster funder. They may say, oh, no, we are in the space of children, we are in the space of environment, we are in the space of older adults. Well, when a disaster hits, you are a disaster funder because you care about the sector that you fund and you do join in. You may also want to fund disasters overall when it's a really huge one, but the reason that it is important for us to think about major infrastructure organizations to work with is because of the expertise that GIA, CDP, and FPN bring. So I do want to do a commercial for all three of you, to any funders who happen to be listening. There is value in being a member or a supporter of all three of you. So I want to then take it to, Bob kind of said it and Anna did too, the best role a funder can have is preparing well before a disaster ever hits. So if you are a national funder in the older adult space, and a beautiful example is the Hartford, John T. Hartford Foundation, who's underwriting this series. After Katrina and that set of disasters, they funded what should funders do with a disaster as it impacts older adults. So the beautiful part is there's a ton of research out there that is accessible when we work through partners such as GIA or CDP or FPN. So kudos to Hartford for that research back then. But when we think about CDP and what they can offer is, again, because people are not maybe naturally disaster funders, CDP can actually help a community. They can help a foundation with their services to get yourself prepared on the if, when it can come. Do you as a foundation want to be a convener? Do you as a foundation want to be a donor? And getting ahead of it is just, that's the place to be, because reacting ends up in the emotional space, and that's not where older adults deserve our attention. So getting back, I want to encourage any funder who is on this line to think about what they can do ahead of time to clarify what they as a funder do, particularly in the space of older adults, and then figure out who to partner with but use the expertise that's available through GIA, CDP, and FPN.
Well, thank you for that promotional, but also the great information. And, you know, the Patterson Foundation really, in some ways, specializes in communication issues. And we have a question from one of our audience about that specifically. So the question is, what do you find to be the best communication tools when you're trying to reach older adults in these kind of situations, both before, during the preparedness phase, and after, during the recovery phase?
Well, I'll take a shot at it and then let the experts weigh in. I definitely feel in the older adult space, it is a blend of high touch and there is a blend of tech. Let us not ignore the fact that the fastest growing population on Facebook is older people 50 and above. So never underestimate the power of technology. But at the same time, people are learners. They're lifelong learners, as we've learned through the whole age-friendly movement. People don't stop wanting to be in charge of themselves. In providing ways in gatherings, whether it's through senior centers, whether it's through I love the evolution of the CERT, Community Emergency Response Teams, where neighborhoods, a congregate living facility, you can be your own emergency response team. And that's where all the wisdom that people have gathered over the years, they can bring to the table. And there's models out there for people to use. So I vote for a blend of touch and tech before and even during. Thank you.
Well, Anna, let's stick on that question for a moment, and we'll come back to Deborah with some additional questions. But with that question about communication tools, have you found particular tools? Obviously, the Playbook is one that seemed to be particularly effective either in before a disaster hits or afterwards.
Yeah, the Playbook was definitely designed for community foundations or funders or anyone else working in the disaster recovery space that could use it in their community. I mean, we've used it with some, Habitat affiliates and some, just kind of local nonprofits that I've interacted with because they play that frontline role in disaster response in each of their communities in different ways. And so the Playbook was certainly designed to do that and help them look at different things. We also have, for funders specifically, CDP has another resource called the State of Disaster Philanthropy that gauges who is funding what and where. And this past year, we've actually made some really big changes to our mapping dashboard. So you can actually look at it now and see current funds to some of these disasters. And you can already see we've worked with the foundations that are on this project, and their data analysts have all populated in the grants as we know them so far. I mean, it's certainly not a perfect picture or a complete picture because that picture changes every single day, but you can definitely look at who's funding what, where, and what we know so far via that tool. It really is interesting to see it evolve.
Thanks. Bob, you talked a little bit about your experience being Area Agency on Aging Director during a disaster response. Were there, and you talked about some communication tools. Are there others that you know of that you find particularly effective?
Well, I think as others have said, it's really important to be working in concert with emergency management when you're working at the local, regional, or state level, because they have vehicles in terms of their daily briefings that they're able to get information out. But it's just really good to know who those individuals are as well. And to Deborah's point, I think it is critically important to use that blend of high touch and technology. We found that getting information out to key individuals does have that ripple effect of their spreading the information as well. I think just that we used to call it teleperson, just person-to-person exchange, does have a very vital role. I think for planning and communication purposes, what we discovered through experience was that a number of communities really were not knowledgeable who their residents were, or whether those residents might be at home or not be at home. So we came up with a planning design to help those communities to identify who those potential at-risk individuals might be, adults with disabilities and others who might have special challenges, and to identify those on the front end and to be able to keep that information in multiple places for easy access. And we also found in our design that it was important to go deep in the leadership planning, because you never know when a disaster is going to hit, and you need to have a second tier or even a third tier person with the ability to respond, and to make sure all this is coordinated with the CERT team, with the Emergency Operations Center, the Emergency Management Agency, just that to the degree that individuals can participate or be knowledgeable of individuals that are participating in those planning efforts, I think just really helps the planning process to be better prepared, and therefore your ability to communicate is made more effective.
Well, thanks, Bob. I'm going to turn this question now to Anna for her response, but then I would like the other two of you to respond as well. And that's about, we use terms like the preparatory phase, and then the disaster phase, and the recovery phase. And a question from one of our audience about what do these mean more specifically? How long do they last? Is the immediate disaster a month, 6 weeks, 2 years? And then what is the recovery period like? And obviously that blends into the preparedness for the next disaster. So I wonder if Anna, if you could talk about that, and also if you have any specific advice about things that foundations can do specifically around the issue of finding, of helping at each of these phases.
Sure. So disasters definitely have certain phases once the event occurs. That initial phase is what we typically call the relief phase, and it tends to be focused on, all the services have been interrupted in an area, or there's massive flooding, and so people need an emergency shelter. They need food because they're in an emergency shelter and they don't have it. They need things, that are going to get them through those first few weeks until basic services like the power, the water, all those things start to be restored. I wouldn't say that there is necessarily a time, and it fluxes with each disaster. I think anytime you start to transition away from search and rescue and the shelter levels start to dial down, I mean, at that point, you're truly starting to transition out of the relief phase. It varies with each disaster. There's tornadoes where it might be a few weeks. Different places in Houston and Hurricane Harvey, we saw that, some places had people in shelters for a few days. Some people had them there for weeks. So it definitely varies with each disaster. And once we transition out of relief, we sort of transition into this early recovery and recovery phase. And that early recovery is when you start to look out houses and gut houses and, clear debris and those sorts of things. And then from there, we transition into what we call long-term recovery. And long-term recovery is where you really start, what are the mental health needs going to be? What are the long-term needs of this community going to be following a disaster? And that looks different in every single community. And I realize that's a really fluid answer, but it really will look different based on each community and what has happened there. And preparedness is something that I always say you can implement on every single phase of a disaster. I mean, it's something you should think about when there's no disaster going on. And it's something you should think about early on, early recovery, when you're starting to, how many houses you have to rebuild, and if you need to revamp your housing plan for the entire city and those kinds of things. They all need to be looked at as you work through those phases, because that is often, it's at the forefront of all of our minds, but certainly even when there's not a disaster, the things that we just all talked about, the networks and the mechanisms where you're looking at, if a disaster happens, what are our weakest points and can't talk right now, what should we be thinking about, certainly come into play. And I feel like there was a second part of this question that I'm not answering now that I've gone through all of that.
No, I think you answered both of them.
Okay.
So Deborah, so to come to the second part, which is that question around what is it that philanthropy can or should be doing? I think we almost always focus on the relief part of the process, and then the recovery part, and then the preparedness part get much more difficult to find funding for that. So have you seen strategies that seem to work to pull people together, to keep reminding them that recovery is a long process? Deborah, you with us?
No, I was the one being asked. I apologize. Okay. Yes,
No,
I am.
okay.
Okay.
All right.
So,
sorry.
well, I'm going to weigh in on a few angles of this one too. This is part of that high touch part. It's forming the teams who will keep the conversations going. And when we're thinking about that long-term recovery, it actually is part of building the resilience. In resilience, building resilience is a forever kind of thing. So funders have their opportunity of using their convening power, and that convening people, business, nonprofit, government, and the media. And speaking of the media, when we talk about the timing, as Anna was going through how long it usually lasts, the media has such a big role on keeping the disaster front and center, or it no longer is something that people are paying attention to. And we can even see that a little bit in this recent. Harvey got a lot of attention, then Nate didn't get attention. So media has a big role on how big and how long each of the phases go. But that building resiliency only happens when we continue to be in the room and working together. I did want to give one example of getting ahead of the curve. We say about, let's prepare before the disaster. And this is something that we learned a long time ago from the San Francisco Community Foundation, where they actually developed MOUs with key organizations who fit certain criteria and were participating in disaster preparedness. So that when the disaster hit, they were able to respond very quickly with the kind of needs that may not have been normally supported in the relief phase. So that's why that community convening role that funders can have is so very important.
Bob, anything to add about how funders can be particularly active in the different phases of the disaster process?
Well, I think both Deborah and Anna have really hit the high points here. I would say that that if funders can stay committed to the long-term recovery efforts, I think that is a critical role for really to do that mitigation, advanced preparation, for the next potential incident. And I'll give an example now with here in Florida, Community Foundations of Florida, which are an integral part of FPN, are looking at those long-term needs and are really seeing the impact that Irma has had on Florida with respect to affordable housing. That issue already existed, but it really has been escalated in some communities, whether it's the Florida Keys or other parts of Florida as a result of the disaster. So being able to keep that conversation on the table and to be able to try to identify potential solutions to it long term, so that we're better situated, going forward in the future in every aspect of the word, I think is really important.
Anna, I'll come back to you. Bob just talked about the particular impact on housing, and so this question is around transportation, and that we see in these kind of environments where very often it's the people that rely on public transportation who have the most difficulty because these systems are often disrupted and so on. Do you see any new strategies around this or out-of-the-box solutions around transportation that you would point people to?
Personally, I haven't seen anything that has maybe been extremely new or out of the box in our recent situations. Maybe that's something those of us on this call should be getting together about. But yeah, for sure, transportation is, those people who rely on public transportation are definitely even more vulnerable following each of these. And, I'd even point out sometimes in these particular populations, even access to a car or being able to drive. I mean, in Texas, there were families with multiple cars who had been flooded and damaged and weren't able to use them at all. So even relying on family members who you would normally rely on is sometimes not even the best solution. So it has definitely been an interesting issue, and there's a lot of insurance side caveats that come in there. So something we've tracked, but not necessarily something I've seen a new solution to recently.
Bob or Deborah, anything on transportation?
I would like to weigh in. Again, this is the ahead of the curve thing, but because again, if you're rural, if you're suburban, if you're urban, the issues are going to be all different. But one new innovation that has emerged in our region is the independent transportation network, where people volunteer to drive other people to where they need to go. And our independent transportation network locally has turned out to be quite a jewel in non-disaster times. But during the recent disaster, it was like cell phones still work and people could get a ride from where they need to go. So communities should really check out the independent transportation network that's around the country. You create it at your own level. Again, may not work in all communities, but it's something to explore.
Thanks very much. The question, I think, let's stick to one more specific topic here, which is the general topic of mental health. And as the questioners ask, we know that older adults, particularly those with chronic diseases, can decompensate very quickly during emergencies. Are there some effective ways and innovative ways that we can see helping people with chronic illnesses in these kind of disasters? I think we all were probably, both horrified and struck by the images of the nursing home where the water came in to the facility, and won't ever forget those images. But obviously, the impact of someone living through that kind of experience is something that probably is going to last for a long time. So are there ways in which philanthropy can help in providing mental health services in the recovery process? And I'll let anybody take that one.
I mean, I'm happy to start. I know that not necessarily maybe in Florida, but in other disaster areas that I've worked in, such as Louisiana, there's been local health clinics that have immediately started disaster related sessions or group sessions, and that they have found them to, once they started them, to be both in high demand and very well received. And I think that's probably one of the best ways. I mean, we actually recently funded this through our Louisiana Disaster Recovery Alliance, one of these local clinics that's doing that. I mean, in areas of Louisiana, we had people who went through multiple disasters. Some of them went through Katrina, and then several years, 8 years later, they're going through some pretty severe flooding. And then again, here in the last couple of years, we've seen that again. And so they just found that this was a really big need in their community. And so some of the smaller local clinics really took this on as conducting group sessions with people who had been through these disasters, and then also doing one-on-one sessions. And they sought out private funding to support their counselors as they were doing those activities. And I think I was really excited to see what they were doing. And personally, I think it was maybe some of the most rewarding work, just hearing them talk about it. And obviously, I didn't even talk to any of the patients. I'm just talking to the people who are doing the work. So I think that it's a beautiful thing to be able to provide your community.
I think that we could look at it from an additional lens of whatever funder group one finds oneself in, if mental health is part of it, and in the world of older adults, that is definitely a growing field. Add the disaster dimension into that conversation. So if you're already a funder in the mental health department, add the disaster dimension to discussion. If you're not in the mental health older adult funding space, then it's, gosh, is it time that we did? So I think it's a funder stepping back and going, what is my role in the long-term recovery of the population that I care so much about?
Bob?
I think both Deborah and Anna have given us really great insights here. I would just say let's remember that first initial, first week, post disaster, how important it is for us to really promote community where every individual is having some type of welfare check. What we found in doing door-to-door assistance, whether it's going up, 25 flights of condo stairs or, going through a mobile home community, was just the value from that individual, living alone. Of course, the census tells us about 1 out of 5 older adults does live alone. So it's important that they know that someone in their community really does care for them, as any one of us has that same feeling, post disaster. Just that initial touch, that high touch that Deborah spoke about earlier, I think is critically important. But I really like the thoughts that my colleagues have shared, that we've got to realize that recovery takes time, and just like physical infrastructure recovery can take time, so can one's mental health and mental well-being take time too, and that we assure that we have the resources that are readily available to assist with those needs.
I think we have time for one more. So Anna, I'm going to turn to you. Quite rightly, I think a lot of the focus today has been on providing services to local communities and to regions of the country, because that's where the intense need is after a disaster. But is there both a need and progress being made on developing national strategies or national ways of thinking about these issues, either for funders or for the general community?
Absolutely. I think, anytime you can bring the best practices from various communities that have experienced these things into a national framework and get everybody on the same page and talking, it's extremely beneficial to all the communities we serve.
Deborah or Bob, anything about how we can take this to a larger or even regional effort as opposed to just in the local area that's directly affected?
Well, I'm going to again encourage no funder can act alone. We have to work with others who are funding in our space. We need to connect with those beyond our space. And that's why the philanthropic infrastructure organizations, whether it's Florida Philanthropic Network or the Southeastern Council of Foundations, or again, issue focused with grant makers and aging. The fact that in Louisiana, there's a Louisiana Disaster Fund, that's the belief that together we are stronger, in trusting that we will work together, put the money in, and then decide what is the best use of that money together. And actually, we end up smarter as we learn through the process. No disaster is like another disaster, but there are elements that carry forward. So it's understanding every disaster is unique, whether it's the wildfires out in California or whether it's an earthquake in another region of the land. So again, it's the funders being open to learning and understanding how they fit in the mosaic.
Bob, any words on that one?
John, I just to Deborah and Anna as well, I just echo what they've said. I think it's just really important that we continue to collaborate and communicate. I know here at FPN, what we have endeavored to do in working with both you and Grantmakers in Aging and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy is to help our members stay abreast about what is happening, what's available as resources, also to let our colleagues know where specific disaster relief funds have been set up and where philanthropy can direct dollars. I think just serving that clearinghouse role for a network like FPN is critically important, and similar with our national and local and regional partners as well. Just helping to disseminate that information is critically important, and then just learning from the experience, because next time we can improve upon what we've done this time, and we do that I think by learning from our experience, but also learning from one another.
At this point, I want to return to our panelists one last time for their final words of wisdom to our audience. And Anna, we'll start with you.
Thanks, John. The last thing I would leave everybody with is just to remember that all of the disasters we're dealing with across the country right now are going to go on for years. This is not going to be a few weeks or a few months, but it's going to go on for years. So as you fund things right now, and you rightfully should be funding things right now, you should be hanging on to some of those funds for the long term, for the bigger picture, because as your communities work out of the situations they're in, they're really going to need that support.
Deborah?
I think I would like to remind each of us that funders don't have all of the answers. I think it's not us deciding, it's not arriving with the answer, but rather collaborating with experts. It's collaborating with the different sectors, again, businesses, nonprofit, government, media, and individuals. And I want to do a quick example of, in our community, Sarasota demographically is the oldest large county in America. So we are the petri dish for the rest of the nation during this longevity revolution. But our network of resident facilities for older adults, they created their own collaboration of how they would deal with disasters. And they have done, what do you call those? Test runs, even before a disaster. I forget what we call those. Fire drills. But they've tested it. And during Irma, honestly, it was so beautifully orchestrated. I can't praise the providers enough for doing that on their own and pulling it together. So we can learn from them, and then, maybe a funder could give them a good housekeeping seal of approval, unrestricted bonus grant for doing such a great job collaborating.
Bob?
Well, disasters come in all sizes and shapes and whatevers, and I've learned that whether after I worked Hurricane Elvis, a high windstorm that hit Memphis, prior to moving to Florida in 2003, just in time for the 2004 hurricane season, having Francis hit our service area in September, and then Gene forgetting the rule that lightning doesn't strike twice, but someone forgot to tell hurricanes the rules. So you just have to really be prepared, for whatever might come your way. And today's response effort in one part of the country, whether it's a flood or a hurricane, like when I was in Kentucky, it might be snow or ice, and working with the Department for Public Health to make sure that older adults with chronic disease had access to medications was critically important. So I think what I would like to do is close with a quote from Catherine the Great, who said, "I beg you to take courage. The brave soul can mend even disaster." It really does take the brave souls among us to come together, to unite, and to work together to affect change, but to be there for one another in the true spirit of being a neighbor to one another, throughout this great nation.
A great final word. I want to thank Anna Hurt, Bob McFalls, and Deborah Jacobs for their participation in today's program. We thank you for all that you all do to make life better for older adults and people of all ages. We also want to thank the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, the Florida Philanthropic Network, and the Patterson Foundation for their co-sponsorship of today's webinar, and the John A. Hartford Foundation for their support of this webinar series. We will be making this presentation available to anyone who wishes to view it later, including both the slides and audio. Watch for a rebroadcast link on our website or contact Grantmakers at Aging at info@giaging.org. And please join us for 2 upcoming webinars next Monday, November the 20th, at a special time of 1 p.m. Eastern. Researchers from the Alzheimer's Association will be joining us to discuss new developments in research, care, support, and prevention of Alzheimer's. And on Thursday, December 1st at 2 p.m., which is our regular time, we will be joined in a special presentation by the new Administration for Community Living Administrator and HHS Assistant Secretary on Aging, Lance Robertson. This will be one of his first official presentations to the broader aging community, so we hope you will join us for that. You can find out more information about these webinars on giaging.org. And finally, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.